I'm Sam, as it says on the screen. Very excited to be here. I've never been to Sweden before. I've never been to this conference. I came through Denmark. I've never been there, so I'm on an adventure. Very happy to be here. I work at Google on the Firebase team. Specifically, I do developer relations, which means that I help people like you solve their problems when they want to make their apps better. Who here develops a mobile app or wants to? Okay, good, because there's mobile in the title. And before I worked on Firebase, which has not always been at Google, I was working on a lot of authentication products like Google Plus platform when we were still doing a lot of Google Plus and Google Sign In, which is still active today, and I still work on that. So today I want to tell you about how you can use Firebase to make your mobile authentication problems a thing of the past. If my arrow keys would work, I will tell you that. Okay. So first of all, like authentication is very scary. If you're not scared of authentication, you should be scared of authentication. Nobody has ever implemented an authentication system and not had a nagging thought in the back of their head that they did it completely wrong or they left a big security hole. So how many of these things sound familiar to you? Like this application would like to post to your Facebook timeline from now till the end of eternity. I feel like every confirmation dialogue I have to read so carefully. Or what about when you're setting your password? Like you need 32 characters and like an emoji at the end is what my bank password looks like these days. And how about this? Has anybody ever written code like that and thought like, I'll take that out, and then you don't? I mean, authentication is kind of a disaster, but it doesn't have to be this way. Like you can get on with your life. These problems are solved. People think about them all the time. So what do I mean when I'm talking about authentication in 2017? It's more than the small topic it used to be. It means a lot of things. So right off the bat, users don't like authentication. These figures are from Blue Research. 86% of users are bothered when they have to create a new account. So if your application has authentication, you've bothered 86% of your users. Maybe it varies with implementation, but they're not happy. 54% of your users would leave your site or app before registering. So they see your create a new account screen and they go, I'll find another way to do that. So like if you're thinking about your app in terms of a funnel, you're cutting off more than half the funnel. And 77% of users believe social sign-in is a good solution to these problems. I don't think that's because everybody likes giving out the ability to post on Facebook. Like I said, I think it's because it's one tap as an experience, and people just don't want to deal with your authentication flow. So let's say you want to build an app, or you're building an app, and you get to the part where you're going to do auth. What do you have to do? Let's go through the checklist. So first of all, you're going to have, if you say email and password sign in, you need your database with passwords secured. You'd be surprised that you need to give this advice these days. People are still storing passwords in plain text. I know, my passwords have been stolen in plain text. You need to do email verification. If I sign up and say I'm Sundar at google.com, please don't believe me, because then when the real Sundar comes to sign up, he's going to be mad at me. You need to make some sort of token. At the end of authentication session, you're going to create a cookie or a token. So now you need to either read some documentation about authentication or make your own token format. Do not make your own token format, but people do. And now that you have tokens, what about replay attacks? Like how powerful are these tokens that you're putting in the hands of any computer or app that is running your software? So you need to mitigate replay attacks, the kind of thing where someone goes to a coffee shop, intercepts your token, and now is acting on your behalf. That was really popular when sites were on HTTP. You're going to need password reset flows. I've forgotten every password I've ever set. So if you think that's a one and done operation, you're wrong. And those have their own massive security problems. I mean, you need to make sure not to allow an attacker to reset passwords. And people these days have many devices, or they get a new device, and they expect accelerated experiences when they return. Like they don't want to go through your whole flow every time they pick up another tablet. And this just goes on and on. These are just some that I've had to deal with before. Oh, and like what could go wrong when you're doing all this? Here are some headlines. 117 million accounts, 150 million accounts, 65 million. Like I said, I recently had my social security number stolen. A big company, which I won't name and shame, had 3 billion accounts stolen recently. I mean, I hope if my app ever makes TechCrunch, that's not the headline. I want people to be talking about what my app does. So the stakes are high. users are annoyed, and you can make them really annoyed. So this is why, unless you're better at all of this than anybody you've ever met, and maybe you are, you should use an authentication service. Let someone else handle your authentication. When you use an authentication service, you're getting people who think about auth all day to solve these problems for you. So if they're not going to do it right, nobody is. Additionally, this should be easier than building your own auth. Any authentication service you use is likely going to have very simple integration, and you're just going to focus on making your app great, not making a great login screen. And if you think about this advice, I mean, authentication services aren't as ubiquitous as they should be, but we're not processing our own credit cards anymore. Most people are using Stripe or something like that. You don't wire the electricity to your house. It's dangerous, and somebody can do that better, and you can just let them handle it. But yet people insist on doing their own authentication. Like I said, these services, they keep track of all the security and all the exploits day by day, so you don't have to. You can get on with your life. There are a ton of good options out there for authentication service, but if you read the title of this talk, you know I'm going to tell you how to use Firebase. And like I said, the main benefit is someone else using your auth. So if you're not interested in Firebase, you can still learn a lot from the principles here. Firebase authentication supports multiple login methods. So this is not presenting to your users a sign in with Firebase button. We don't provide identity. We manage all of the hard parts of authentication. The identity is brought into Firebase. And if you're using other bits of Firebase in your app, you get some Firebase superpowers, but those are totally optional. When I say multiple methods, you can sign in with Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, phone number, email. Those are all the ones by default, and you can also bring in your own custom method, so it's extremely flexible. Let's start with the basics. Just a disclaimer, I'm a big Android nerd. This seems to be the unofficial Android room today. When I show mobile code, it will be Android Java, but one of the things that Firebase Auth helps to solve is having a consistent experience across platforms. So you can assume, and I'm not lying, that anything I do here can be done on all three of these platforms and in some server-side languages as well where it makes sense. Phone number auth does not make sense on the server, etc. So what's the first thing you're going to do when you're evaluating a new auth service? You want to sign in the user. When you use Firebase Authentication, you're just going to make a single call to sign in or sign up. You're not going to be doing any fancy token dance. If you've ever done even an auth standard like OAuth by yourself, you know what I'm talking about. When you make the call, it's going to synchronize the client state and the backend state, so you're not going to be constantly going back and forth to the server to ask on your auth state. And all the networking and threading is handled, which seems like a minor point, but when most applications won't open if their auth doesn't succeed, you might as well let someone do that for you. So let's look at some code. Bullet points don't really describe it. This is like the simplest Android example for signing in with Firebase. So this is a sign-in method. It takes an email and a password. You can see I'm getting an instance of Firebase Auth. There's no configuration there. I don't pass in some scary secret. In fact, you don't have to put any secrets on the device. This means if somebody cracks open your binary, you're still okay. Firebase Auth understands from the context what it's talking to. The method is called sign in with email and password. I think that's about as simple of a name as we could have given it. And you just get a callback when it's done with the Firebase user. So in there, all that good stuff that I was just talking about happened, and all you do is accept the user when it's done. Hopefully that seems about as easy as you could make it. Now, I just jumped right in, and I started to show you how to sign in. But if you'll remember, I was saying that kind of annoys users, so that's a contradiction. Why does every app have to start with a sign-in screen? I'm sure there are plenty of things in most apps that you can do without signing in. And users really hesitate to hand over their email and make a new account, especially before you've demonstrated any value to them at all. You haven't proven that you're worthy of this information that they're going to give to you. So it's important to consider different flows for authentication. Is there a way we could track the user moving through our app without signing them in first? So that leads to a pattern that in Firebase we call anonymous authentication. We didn't invent it, it's just the name for it. This allows you to get a stable user ID without user interaction. It also makes sure that requests are coming from trusted devices. And later, when you know more about the user, you can attach their identity to this user ID. So you're just going to get and essentially random ID for the user, but that will remain stable until you ask the user for more information later. A good example of when you would use this is, let's say your app has a shopping cart or a to-do list. The user can add things to their cart, and they don't need to sign in until they're ready to check out, at which point they'll probably give you their email. They're intending to spend some money. In the meantime, you can store the shopping cart under this user ID. When they do sign in, you attach their identity. The user ID doesn't change. There's no need to have like a staging area in your database. It's all attached to the same user. So this is very, very similar to the code before, but you'll notice there are no arguments to this method at all. I just call sign in anonymously. What that means is you can call this right when your app starts without asking the user to do anything. The networking is handled asynchronously, so it's not going to block anything. But now you've got this ID, you can start attaching to different places. And now you're still dealing with Firebase user. You'll notice it's not like Firebase anonymous user or something. Your app code can behave like it's signed in. You just really won't be able to personalize, like you won't know the user's name or their email. So once you've got this anonymous account, you're probably going to want to upgrade it eventually. So it's extremely simple to take an anonymous account and upgrade it to a social identity, Google, Facebook, or even email password. And that's what we call account linking. And with the anonymous case, there's nothing to merge, right? The user says, this is my Google account, and you merge it into the user. That's okay. But what about when you want to merge two accounts that have real credentials? A good example of this is I go to your website and I log in with Google because you have, the Google, Facebook, whatever buttons. Then I go to your mobile app and I don't remember which one I clicked online, so I click Facebook. Well, I'm going to be kind of annoyed if now I have two accounts on your service, but you'd be surprised how many websites and apps that you go to, that's exactly what will happen. Or they're overly aggressive about trying to match users, and that's a huge security hole because I can go create a Google Plus account with your name on it and now steal things that you've logged into Facebook with. With Firebase, we're going to handle account linking automatically. You can provide multiple credentials on one account. They're only merged if it's safe. That means if the email's been verified, if the user has recently logged in with the previous authentication method, which is extremely important. You need to verify that they own both of the credentials that you're trying to link. And of course, with all of these, whether you're linking from anonymous or not, you're going to keep that stable user ID, which is really important. It's exactly what you probably want. So here's how I'd link an existing account to Google Sign-In. The argument here is a Google Sign-In account. If you're using the Android Google Sign-In SDK, that's the result of clicking the Google Sign-In button. It's kind of outside the domain of Firebase, so I'm not going to mention. Let's talk how you get that. Again, it's Firebase Auth again. You give Firebase Auth the ID token. We'll come back to this, but that's important. That token is not dangerous to pass around, whereas access tokens in OAuth are quite dangerous to pass around. And then you say, I'd like to link the current user to that credential. And again, it's just a simple flow where it goes off and it does whatever it can do. It might try a few different things, and you'll get back a user if it works, or an error if it doesn't. One case where it wouldn't work is if you are trying to link two users who don't seem to have the same email address, or one user, the Facebook account hasn't verified the email, so it's likely an attempt to hijack another user's account. These are all things that you probably, maybe you never thought of before I mentioned them, and you don't want to worry about anyway, and it's just 5 lines of code on your Android app, and you're done. So, showing you some of the basics, a few of the different ways you can get into the app. I hope that it makes the point that there are multiple flows here. But we haven't really done anything yet. Our app just gets a Firebase user. The reason you authenticate at all is to integrate with other services. You want to prove identity somewhere else. So let's talk about how Firebase Auth integrates with a backend. Like I said, what are the main reasons you authenticate? Well, the first one is probably personalization. At the very least, if I log in, your app should be, hello Sam, or show my profile picture or something. That's obvious. The second one is access control. Your app has data somewhere. Users should only be able to access very specific parts of the data. Maybe everybody can read posts that are marked public. I can edit my own profile. You can't edit my profile. Admins can edit everybody's profile. All these things require assertions of identity. And the third one is synchronization. which is it's 2017, people expect that when they pick up a new device, a new computer, all of their data is there, and it's all registered to their identity. If they lose their phone, they don't want to lose everything. So synchronization also requires an assertion of identity. If you've never heard of Firebase Auth, but you've heard of Firebase, the part that you probably use is the database, Firebase database. And the reason I mention this is because these two products were really built to work together. So while Firebase Authentication can authenticate you to any database, I'm going to run through this one integration. One of the main things you're going to get here is declarative access control. So think less if statements and more defining the security you want to have. Automatic token management. If you use Firebase Auth correctly, you'd never have to touch a token, or at least not a dangerous one, which is nice. Less opportunity to make mistakes. I make a mistake whenever I'm given an opportunity to do so. And you're going to get end-to-end security because systems were built by the same people. So a little bit of step back. Here's some code I pulled off my own GitHub from one of the first Ruby on Rails applications I ever wrote. And this is when every tutorial started with how to build your own auth form. And it's simple enough. I thought it was cute to call a salt a pepper. It tells you how seriously I was taking security at the time. But what you'll notice here is that I did it myself. So the problems that are going to come with this are whatever Ruby on Rails version and bcrypt library I downloaded at the time, that's still going to be in place. Additionally, I just wasn't keeping up with whatever the best practice is in authentication. And most people never revisit their auth code, as proven by the fact that this is still on my GitHub and it's very old. I think that probably wouldn't even run on Ruby on Rails anymore. So when you use Firebase Authentication and Firebase Database, there's a totally different approach to access control, which I think even if you're not using the database, you can learn a lot from the way it's thought about. The access control model is tied directly to the data structure in a configuration language, not in code, which is really important because you don't want the fact that you did or did not remember to add an if auth statement in your data reading code to be the one thing that keeps attackers out. So here I've got a database. It's got some rules. This is a social application, so there are posts and profiles. In the post, I'll say anybody can read them. That's just flat out true. And to write a post, you need to have a non-null UID, which implies that you've signed in some method. For profiles, I'll say that you can only write to a profile if the UID of your authentication matches the profile. The important thing here is that the entire request is evaluated against these rules before any data is accessed at all, which means that there's no chance of forgetfulness causing a data leak, which even if you know what you're doing, we all forget. We have good and bad days. Oh, and the one other thing I'd like to mention about that is when you do authentication this way, a lot of people, let's say you're using authentication to talk to a more traditional database and you're running your own server, you probably have inserted a proxy server in between your app and the database to validate the user's identity. At the very least, that's an extra round trip. It's nice for your database and your auth system to understand each other, so that because in mobile apps, these round trips cost a lot. So the last few slides only talked about some basic things like using Firebase in the client of your app, using it with another Firebase product, and I bet everybody here is thinking, well, like that's kind of overly simplistic. I have 6 different other business requirements, and I have my own servers, and I need to customize this. I'm not going to rip out my authentication solution just because I heard this cool talk in Sweden. And that's totally fair. But this is Firebase Authentication is a totally standalone solution which can help you solve these problems while integrating with whatever system you have set up right now. So let's look at this kind of simple app I have. It's communicating with 3 basic services. I've got Firebase Authentication. I've got the Firebase database. I'm using that for some real-time stuff. And then I've got my other server. That could be AWS or it could be under my desk. It really doesn't matter. The point is, it doesn't know anything about Firebase, nor should it really have to. And when I ask these 2 systems, who am I? Firebase goes, you're Firebase user ABC. And this server, which predates it, said, you're user 123, which is at the very least an inconvenience, if not a disaster. I mean, now you need to have some sort of mapping between which users signed up, after you adopted Firebase Auth, which didn't, what IDs mapped to which ones. The chances of access control mistakes are going to start to snowball. you might be using other services that are asserting different identities. So the good news is that when you're using Firebase Authentication, it communicates using ID tokens, which is a totally open standard based on JWT, which is pronounced JOT for reasons that I will never know. This allows you to assert identity to any backend. You're not locked in. It also allows you to do some cool things like not worry about token management because these tokens are not dangerous, and you're never going to write any crypto, even though I've started to say the word token, which might have scared some people off. You're never going to have to do any manual cryptographic operations, which means that there's no chance that your app is going to expire or gain security holes over time, or lower chance. Here's what one of these tokens look like. It's just JSON with a signature. I've omitted the signature here because it's garbage. It looks like random letters. There's a few fields in the specification that must be there. Sub is one of them. That's the user's ID. But you can lump random things into these tokens, which is why they're such a flexible standard, why Firebase and many other services have chosen to adopt them. So email verified, that's a custom thing that Firebase is going to put in there. If it's verified the user's email already, that's true. And now that's signed, so you can take the token's word for that. The profile picture, these are things that frequently you want to use in the same context as auth. There is a size limit. I don't know off the top of my head. Don't go stuffing your database into the tokens, as fun as that might sound. But the point is that they're extremely extensible. Like I said, it's an open standard. Who's using it? Many more than on this slide. But Firebase, Auth0, which is extremely popular. It's part of the OAuth spec, and AWS Cognito accepts them. I think Microsoft Azure uses them in some capacity as well. But and a lot of applications use just the spec without any intermediate library. So this is the basic flow when you're using an ID token. Your app does the sign-in call that we talked about earlier. That goes to Firebase. And Firebase sends back this user object, which you've seen 3 or 4 times now. The user object contains the ID token, just a string. You send that to your backend, which can verify it, and it sends down whatever cookie or session that you're normally expecting. So in that picture with the three services, that backend can keep sending down to your device whatever cookie you were using before you ever heard of Firebase or came to this talk. This is Android code again. I get my user, and then I call getToken. The true argument means that I really need a non-expired token. Otherwise, you could do this synchronously. The user always has a token, but we issue ones that expire every hour. So if you're going to use this to assert identity and not just read some fields, you should get a fresh token. Asynchronous operation, you get back just a string. What you would do here is use your favorite HTTP library and send this up to the server, and now you're in that second leg of the call. This is not Android code anymore, although it looks a lot the same. Again, Java person here. This is my Java server. You'll notice that there are still references to Firebase here because Firebase offers server libraries to verify these tokens, but because it's a standard, there are dozens of Java libraries that could do this exact same snippet here. So you've gotten this token from your HTTP request, HTTPS request, or you haven't done anything good, and you verify the token. This single call checks that the token is signed correctly, was signed for you, so not just that it's cryptographically valid, but that the recipient was meant to be your server. That's done through a client ID, which is put into the token before it's signed. And if it's verified, then you get this decoded token object, and now you have the user's UID. And this gives you assurance that the user is who they say they are. So a lot of people who use Firebase Authentication include these tokens as a header on every request as a way of always verifying the UID when they're talking to their legacy systems. So now we can communicate identity to your server, but that's also not enough because you almost definitely have identities on your server that you want to communicate in the other direction. Existing users who signed up before you made any changes. Well, the good news about ID tokens is that you can mint them yourself, and Firebase and other services can understand them. So this is a bridge for your custom data to get into Firebase Authentication. And when we're talking about that declarative security model I showed earlier, even the custom data that you add to the tokens can be read in those rules. So you're not leaving the nice world of not writing your own auth if statements all the time. This is server-side Java code again. This is when I say minting a token, and I promise you wouldn't have to do that. Okay, you have to do it, but it's that easy. You can make any claims you want. Claims are the fields of the token I said. So in this case, I'm going to say this user has upgraded to a premium account. So maybe that other server in the picture was my payment database, which you want to keep on premises for various reasons. But you want to mint tokens that assert the user's identity and claims that you can make. And you'll notice here I'm setting the UID, which I never did before. That also allows you to get rid of the situation we had before where the two servers are talking about two different UIDs. Now you can create tokens with whatever UID your existing database came up with. And that's it. This is going to mint a token signed by your server. Now we're back in the client. This is Android code again. The server has sent this token down to the client. That's the reverse of the previous flow. I'm going to say sign in with custom token. That means a token minted by some JWT library. Again, asynchronous call, and I get the Firebase user. So adding a custom token, adding all these custom claims didn't increase the complexity of our client-side code at all. We still have the same object that we're working with, which is nice. So maybe you're sometimes going to let people sign in with Google. Sometimes if they're on your early beta, they can use your other auth system. And in the end, you're just talking Firebase user or slightly different class name on different platforms. And now when we declare security rules, if you're using those, the custom claims are still available to us. So now I can say you can only get into the VIP section of my app, which is the best section by far, if the token has premium account is true, and you can write to the VIP section if you're an admin account. So these are custom claims that you're going to decide on in various ways when you mint the token, and they don't disappear just because you send in. So to recap what just happened, we've flipped the diagram from before. So now your app first asks your backend, hey, give me a token based on whatever signals you're using before. The backend sends down an ID token, standard format. You say sign in with custom token, send that to Firebase. Firebase says, great, that's signed correctly. You use the right library. Here's your Firebase user. Okay, so now we've done some client code, a little bit of server code, and it's fairly easy. None of the things I showed took more than a slide of code. But it's not that easy because there's no UI, which is the thing that annoys the users. They're not annoyed that you have authentication code. They're annoyed that they have to see it. And now you have to build flows that accommodate all the different ways your users might want to get into your app. Let's do a simple example. So this is probably the simplest authentication flow you could think of. It's a sign-in page with email and password and a button that says submit. Okay, great. But you probably want to make it clear the difference between returning and existing users. So now you have, the classic sign in, sign up, divide. This is still really easy. We have 15 lines of code, and don't worry if you can't see the words on the diagram. They're not helpful. We have probably 15 lines of Firebase code and some UI code on Android. That's kind of a lot of code. On iOS, it's not so much. But what if the users forget their passwords? Like I said, okay, now the sign in screen should probably have this little forget password link, goes to forget password flow. That sends an email, which you can do in Firebase, but still it sends an email. Now you have to go tell the user, check your email, come back, bring me the code, start over. So now the branches are starting to get bigger. I mean, this is still like, hopefully nobody thinks this is impossible, but it's annoying. Like I said, you haven't made your app fun yet. And users want choice. 77% of users think that social login is a good idea. So let's add a Google button. Well, that means we need to start with what we call a NASCAR screen, like a screen with all the different logos stacked on top of it. They can choose Google and go into this other flow, or they can choose email and that launches that entire flow from before. At this point, things are getting smaller. You're probably less excited to implement this. But whatever, have another coffee. And well, if you're going to have Google, let's also have Facebook. These are some of the most popular authentication methods. You already have the NASCAR screen. Let's stick that in there. Well, now you have another flow. Additionally, Google and Facebook have some differing ideas about authentication, as you can imagine. So you're going to get callbacks in an entirely different thought model, and you need to make sure that users don't end up signing in twice if either of these initiates a single sign-on flow. So you have to be smart about all the possibilities. You're going to have to read docs on a number of websites. Okay, and now we need account linking flows. Like I said before, you better not give me 2 accounts just because I clicked Google one time and Facebook the other time. linking Google to Facebook is not the same as linking Facebook to Google because you need to verify both credentials. So for every sticker on your NASCAR screen, kind of gets exponentially harder to do the UI, especially because you also have to offer linking social to email, which can require email verification. And what about when the user switches devices? Like I said, people want the accelerated welcome back experience. So let's say you decide to use smart lock, like a password vault, to do this. Now you've got this whole other accelerated flow. And if you're not squinting at this point, well, you're lying because the resolution on this projector is really bad. And of course, you're going to have to do this on iOS and web also, because if you're a modern app, you're probably targeting more than one platform, certainly not just Android. So let's do it a second time. Let's do it a third time. That doesn't look like fun to anybody. Oh, and just because you did it once doesn't mean it's going to stay working forever, or you're going to have that Ruby on Rails code that I showed you from 2013. Your UI will break, devices will change, screens will change. So this is going to require probably one or two people who you're now going to call the Auth team. And even though you got rid of your authentication backend by using Firebase, you still have all this maintenance. In that flow that we showed you, those are screenshots that we actually wrote. We wrote the code. This is a few thousand lines of code in each platform, some more than others, but if you're targeting all three, that's 16,000 lines of code for the UI on top of authentication, and that's after you've already killed the authentication backend. So you have the security part, but the UX part is kind of a mess. What if you could just import the UI? I mean, what if you could just say, kick off UI? How many different ways are there to do a login screen anymore? Besides, some colors and the logo and stuff, how different is yours from everybody else's? Well, you can. FirebaseUI Auth is a library of which I'm the maintainer for Android. It's an open source library built on top of the Firebase SDKs. In fact, the screenshots I showed you were screenshots from a slightly earlier version of FirebaseUI authentication. So we've taken what we know about what users like in authentication from different UX studies and let you import the UI. So not every app has to rebuild all of this. It's a fully featured authentication flow. It includes everything in that flowchart and much more: email, verification, Facebook, Google, etc. You can customize the theme. It's consistent across platforms. You can use this on Android, iOS, and web. It even now has phone number support. If anybody's heard of Digits, which formerly from Twitter, they joined the Firebase team and they brought along all their phone number expertise. So now that's part of Firebase UI and Firebase Authentication as well. And there's no pain here because you're just going to launch it. What does that look like? On Android, if you wanted to launch an authentication flow that had three options for the user: email, phone, or Facebook, which I just chose off the top of my head, this is it. That's all the code. This is you launch this from some button the user clicks or without a button, depending on your flow, and it's going to take off into that whole authentication flow that I showed earlier, and it'll only come back to you when the tree is complete, when the user is either signed in or totally failed in some non-recoverable way. And the phone part is particularly interesting because that's enormous pain. You have to send SMS, verify them. It's nearly impossible to do in multiple countries by yourself. It's one of the really cool things about working with the Digits team is that they know the answers to those questions. So this looks ridiculous, but we've turned thousands of lines of code and we just took off the 1,000. If you want to customize, like I said, that we have customization hooks and it's open source, 5 might change into 35, but there's no way you're going to write hundreds and hundreds of lines of code if you're importing all of your UI. And like I said, you can customize it. Here's a GIF that might cause seizures. You can add colors and themes, and of course it's open source, so you could knock off that front screen if you don't like it without having to write the code for the flows behind it. You can really make it your own. Please check us out on GitHub. Like I said, you'll be dealing with me personally if you go file an issue. If you liked this talk, that might be a good thing. If you didn't, then you can say mean things on GitHub. And iOS and web are some different folks, but we're paying attention there. We love hearing how people are using it, what kind of feature requests they have. If we don't offer enough customization, there's no secret sauce here. It's just a nice UI built on top of the SDK, so it also is a good place to learn about all the pitfalls of authentication. Okay, I have to catch my breath. You probably have to think again. Let's quickly recap what you learned about here, even if you don't ever want to hear the word Firebase again. First of all, do not do your own authentication. If I catch anybody implementing their own authentication like that Ruby on Rails slide, I'm going to be sad when my password gets stolen from your database. Number 2, less authentication and later is better. So start with something like anonymous auth, assigning a random user ID, and ask the user to sign in when you've demonstrated your value to them. The shopping cart example is the most powerful one. Of course, if they're about to give you their credit card, the email is not a big leap. But to just slam an authentication page in their face, we saw the percentages before. Users are not going to be happy. Number 3, use ID tokens. This is a standard that has come about after a lot of hard work by a lot of people who think about auth way too much, and it's a fantastic way to communicate from mobile apps, which are not very trustworthy clients, to assert identity to a server. They don't authorize anything. They don't contain the ability to read your Gmail if they're issued by Google. They just tell you who the user is. So they're a lot safer to keep around. And 4, if you really want to get the UI right and you don't have, a couple of designers to do it full time, just import it. Whether you use FirebaseUI or one of the many other authentication UI libraries out there, there's only so many email screens in the world. You can just import yours. That's it. Thank you all so much for coming.